All right, everybody, welcome back to another video. Here we have why men are rejecting marriage and it's getting worse. You guys seem to like the older guys talking about their experiences in marriage. I do as well. And so let's just go ahead and get into this video.
A long time ago, a wise man once said, "There's a sucker born every day." That quote, or that truism, is more true today than ever before, especially when it comes to men in relationships with women. Let me explain. In psychology, there is a basic understanding that most human relationships have a transactional nature. Now, I know there's a lot more going on there. There's a lot more complexity to human relationships than just this or that, but at its core.
And I just want to interrupt here and say, ever since I started getting really into women so many years ago when I was trying to be like a player, I realized that a lot of women treated relationships very transactionally, while most men treated it more emotionally. We wanted, it's like more love, happiness, respect, all these other things. But I noticed that a lot of women, once they weren't benefiting transactionally, they're like, I'm out. And ever since then, I was like, okay, well, if that's the game that we're playing, I've kind of always adopted it as well. And then, of course, if you say that in public, socially, people want to shame you. It's like, oh, it's not this. And it's usually women who do it. But it's like, that's where I got the idea from, where it's like, if you notice, once a woman is not getting something as far as transactional from you, she's out, you know? And so I just kind of always thought of it like that. What do you guys think? Are you relationships transactional to you?
Especially in romantic relationships, there's a very strong transactional nature occurring. In the past, that transaction was pretty straightforward. Men would trade security, resources, even a commitment in order to have access to a woman's intimacy, i.e. sex, and her ability to provide him with children. It was a pretty straightforward exchange. Her life was essentially going to be taken care of, and her job was essentially to run a household, have children, and provide some intimacy to the man. That was it. Today, the economy has changed a lot. We've been in what I would call an inflationary market. And as you know, in an inflationary market, just because the price goes up doesn't mean the value is increasing. So in today's market, things are much, much different. And there's lots of reasons why these things have changed. But we're still acting in many ways like we did as men a long time ago. And it's not working out to our advantage. The truth of the matter is the value of what men bring to the table these days still has a great deal of value. We still provide a great deal of resources, security, commitment, and that resource is always available to a woman.
And I think one of the things that he didn't mention that's extremely important is structure. Men provide a lot of structure, and just that alone is extremely valuable.
That we're committed to, this 24/7. However, what the woman is bringing to the table, intimacy, and as a big part of that, sex, well, the value of that has been diminished significantly. Yet men and women in these transactions still act like that is the prize. And I think that that's not the case anymore. Legally, men are at a huge disadvantage in the event that for some reason the marriage doesn't work out. Men get their asses handed to them in court. Now, I realize that the statistics say that both men and women suffer in the event of a divorce, and even women even suffer more so in the long run as they get older, because their ability to, I don't know, achieve additional resources is diminished at some point. But yeah, it's a situation where a man in most states, no matter how much wealth he has coming into the marriage, and then how much wealth is created during the marriage, has all of that wealth at stake in the event that marriage ends, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. If I saved $1 million before I met my bride, and then 10 years later we split, I should be able to walk away at least with $1 million I walked into it with. But that's not the way it works in most states. I think in 9 states, that law will allow you to walk away with that money you had prior to the marriage. But in 41 states, yeah, whatever you have from the minute you marry her, she has half of it from that moment forward. It's sort of like when you buy a car, you drive it off the lot and it loses half its value. It's kind of like that. You know, the minute you say, I do, everything you have just lost half its value. God, that's hilarious. So the availability of sex has increased significantly. Our ability to access real sex directly has increased significantly. It's gotten much easier. The barrier is much lower. And worst case scenario, our ability to manage our urges has gotten much easier. You don't need to go to adult bookstores. You don't need to go to pornographic movie theaters. You can do it all in the privacy of your own home. Nobody knows any difference, I guess, except Google. And yeah, you're good to go. You don't have that burning desire like you would have, say, 30 or 40 years ago. But the value of what we're bringing into the relationship has not changed very much. We're still bringing all of our assets, all of our resources, our commitment, and that value has not gone down at all. In fact, if anything, that value has increased quite a bit. So today, we've got this very difficult situation where the vast majority of women in the Western world think that they're playing by rules that existed 50 or 100 years ago. They don't seem to realize that what they're bringing to the relationship doesn't have the same value that it used to. Yet men, in terms of their commitment, because it's a legally binding contract, must provide the structures of the same value that they brought before. So now, as a man, I am paying for a Bentley and I am getting a Hyundai. And the woman is bringing in very little in the way of a transaction, and she gets this lottery ticket that guarantees that she's going to be financially well off for the rest of her life, or at least be able to assume some compensation for whatever it is that she thinks she's performed for an extended period of time, I guess depending on the length of the marriage.
And I think a lot of people know this, especially women. And that's why it's like I said earlier, if you look at relationships transactionally, like tick for tat, I'm doing this, you're doing this, a lot of people demonize that. And I think the reason why they're demonizing it is, one, the people at the top who are demonizing it, they know that if you do an itemized sheet, step by step, compare and contrast, you're going to realize you're getting a bad deal. Right. And then people under that are just trying to appease these people because they want something. And they're like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that and yada, yada. You guys know the little orbiters and stuff. But I've always thought about that. I was like, because I'm a tit for tat person, I don't care if you're like, oh, you shouldn't be doing it. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But I'm still going to do it anyway. When I tit for tat, I'm like, yo, I'm the person of value here. I'm bringing way more that's going to last you a lot longer than you're bringing to me, you know?
So is it any wonder that lots of young men do not want to get married? I mean, if I was a young guy, I would certainly not be wanting to jump into that situation because there's no advantage in it for me whatsoever. I know that a lot of people, men included, like the idea of having kids and a family and a legacy, etc. Well, you know, there are ways around that too. You don't necessarily need to have a relationship, at least an intimate relationship with a woman. You can hire a surrogate. From what I understand, in many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, women will carry a child for you, and they have no legal right to that child. It's under contract, so when that child is born, you become a father, and you are a single dad. So that may be a way for men who really want to have families to be able to do that. And then, you know, then they've got the best of both worlds, you know. They've got the family without the threat of losing the family because of a dissatisfied spouse for some reason.
And I would say if you're going to take that path, I would make sure that you're making enough money to hire like a motherly figure, like a nanny or something. You know what I mean? Like a live-in nanny. I know there's a lot of countries around the world that have programs to where you're able to have a live-in nanny if you're able to afford it, right? Because it's not cheap, obviously. And so I think that will be really well for a child's development, right? Because it's like a single mother decides to break up her family. You know, the missing father figure is going to do damage. And even though I know statistically speaking, like men raise better even if we're single, we've all met somebody who has mother issues. You know what I mean? And so you have to have some type of presence that is motherly around a child, especially in its developmental years.
So although men still have a strong desire for sex, and we certainly pursue it, we have a lot more options as to where we get it. So we don't necessarily have a limited market. You know, even a couple hundred years ago, 150 years, even back in the 1950s, you know, if you were going to meet a girl, it was probably a girl you knew, like from school or in your neighborhood. Now, you can meet a girl anywhere in the world, and there's a wide variety to choose from. So
Wide.
just from the availability of women to men today, and with the availability of easy travel to lots and lots of countries and on a moment's notice, I mean, we can travel anywhere in the world and we can access any number of women very, very quickly. So sex, the value of sex has dropped significantly. But no one has told Western women that this has happened, because they seem to think that they still hold an upper hand in this relationship. And I think that right now they're learning that the worm has turned just a little bit against them, and that men, especially Western men, are not interested in playing this game any longer. Because the way this game has been played, and it was certainly played on me during my marriage, was that the intimacy and the sex was part of the initiation of the relationship. And then once the initiation was complete and we were a few years into our marriage, the intimacy and the sex went away.
And I talked about this on one of my last videos. I will make sure if I had ever decided to get married, that's going to get talked about. And I'm going to say, if that wanes, I'm gone. I'm going to let that know early. I need them to know that this is a priority. It's a priority as the money that we spend for the bills and food every single month, right? Because if I stop paying bills and feeding, right, how long are we going to be in this relationship for, realistically? And so I need sex to be tied into that the same way that bills and food and all that other stuff is tied into that. This is not something that's like, oh, well, I don't really feel like it. You know what I mean? It's like a lot of us don't feel like paying bills, you know what I'm saying? But it has to happen. And so this is something that if and of course, right, better said than done. But I think this is one of those things where I'm going to have that conversation that says, listen, if I feel, I'm going to communicate to you about it, but if it doesn't change, like, I'm going to let you know early, I'm going to be gone.
But the commitment and the marriage contract was still in place. So I was still providing my end of the bargain, and she was no longer providing her end of the bargain. And that's where the Western relationships break down. Is that the sex is a transaction in and of itself, while the marriage is something that has a legal backing. It endures. And the only way for the man to get out of it is to sacrifice literally 50% of his assets. Yeah, the minute you get that ring on her finger, everything you own has just been reduced in value by 50%. And I know, and I have talked a lot about these prenuptial agreements in the past, and the more research I do into them, apparently these prenuptial agreements can be relatively easily ignored by a judge. They don't need to honor them at all.
And I've heard that as well. People say, oh, get a prenup, get a prenup, get a prenup. But I've heard that these things can easily get pierced, you know, unless you have like I'm sure it's like a very complicated way that they go about it, but like a standard prenuptial agreement, I've heard that some judges throw them out completely. And it's like, what?
In fact, if they feel in any way that the woman was put in a disadvantage for any reason whatsoever, they can throw them out and then you start from scratch. So although a prenup certainly is advisable if you're going to get into a marriage, it's not necessarily the protection that I think most guys think it is. So as I was walking around today, I was following this older couple, and I was behind them for a few minutes, and the woman playfully pushed the man. And I'm guessing they were in their mid-70s, just to give you an idea. And you know, she pushed him just in a playful way in the shoulder, and she actually knocked herself off balance just a bit. He barely budged, and but it seemed like they were having a nice time together. And I kind of, you know, I could feel little pangs of jealousy, just a little bit there, because they seemed to have a really good rapport going. And as I got closer, I could overhear them chatting. And she's talking about college football. And she's talking about who is starting for the local football team and who's on second string and things like that. And I'm thinking, oh, isn't that cool, you know? I think that's kind of the thing that most men really, really want to achieve in a relationship, where they can have that kind of a friendship with a woman. Now, obviously, I don't know what their sex life is like, but it seemed like they had a pretty good relationship and probably been together for a pretty long time, given their age. Could be wrong. I could be jumping to all kinds of conclusions. Nevertheless, it seemed like they were having a nice time. I contrast that with these women in these TikTok videos that you see on these red pill channels that are mocking them, you know, where they're screaming and crying that they can't find a man, you know, or my favorites are, of course, you know, the divorced women who are regretting their own divorce and are sad that they left their husbands because now they're struggling in life. Their finances are a wreck. Nobody wants them anymore. And they're finding that they're unable to attract a new partner. Now, I do have compassion for these people, don't get me wrong. I'm not a complete cold-hearted bastard, but maybe a little bit. Maybe just a little bit of a cold-hearted bastard. So I think that the idea of that marriage that lasts a lifetime. And I think about that 75-year-old couple, that mid-70s couple. That idea, that might be something that doesn't exist anymore. That might be something of the past. You know, maybe it will still exist, but it'll be like an endangered species. We might see it from time to time and we'll all stop and stare and ask them questions. But I think that for the most part, the idea of a lifelong marriage, like my grandparents had, that might be going extinct, you know? And unfortunately, it's probably due to a lot of the progress that we've seen in our culture and technology, you know? I think that obviously the sexual revolution played a huge role, and women in the workplace played a huge role. The way we've restructured many of our institutions to give women a benefit and a leg up has played a significant role. And all
And I want to say, I think that's, and I don't want to say there's some group of people in some high tower on a mountain laughing evilly, but I think that that's ultimately the goal, like the plan. If you know anything about like wealth creation or family dynamics, having a large family is extremely powerful in your aid of not only making sure that your family continues, but in building wealth. And so when you come to a place like America, there's certain ideas like the moment your child hits 16 or 18, you kick them out the house. You separate them from the family. That way they can start over from scratch and like the whole like that journey, you know? But if you really think about it, when you go outside to these different countries, you realize that people are staying with their parents 25, 30, 35 until they join somebody else's family. You get what I'm saying? And then those families sometimes will even come together and then create wealth and build empires. And so it's like, if you look at it, it's like you can't have a lot of people doing that. And so what's a good way to stop it? One, try to destroy the family. Two, make everybody feel like they're very valuable and they're not getting what they're worth. And so what that means, they're going to stay single and have all these situationships, right? And just statistically speaking, situationships eventually is going to turn into a pregnancy. And again, that you're already attacking the family dynamic wrong. And so you can't even have a family because you're not even compatible. And then your child's going to join the workforce because they don't have a pathway set up by their family. And then you have a bunch of single people. I think he's right on the right track when I think people wanting to start families and being successful at it is going to be something we look at like, oh my gosh, like they did it. But the average person, the average people, they're going to be either in situationships, co-parenting. They're not going to have that family dynamic. You get what I'm saying?
all these things were done without any real consideration for how it would affect the overall culture. We just assumed that by doing good, that we would get good in the end. And that's not what we got at all. We got something completely different, something no one ever intended. Every once in a while, I'll see some guy in the comments talk about how this is all part of a master conspiracy to break down Western civilization. And I find that wholly funny. I mean, that is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Imagine that
I like how that was literally just, that's funny.
Someone back in the 1960s, when birth control was first invented, thought, here it is. This is our chance. We're going to take down the entire Western way of living. That it's not going to happen until long past my being dead, but we're going to just put together this conspiracy, and for the next 100 years, we're going to make sure that men and women stop having sex, and that'll tear the whole thing down. Well, stop getting married, I should say. We'll always have sex. But yeah, I don't think that's what happened at all. I think it was just a bunch of do-gooders trying to find a way to level the playing field. And I think that most of us would have agreed that, yeah, leveling the playing field would have made a lot of sense, because no one could have foreseen that leveling that playing field would create such an imbalance in our natural relationships. And that's kind of what it's done. And I don't think there's any way to undo it. So since we can't undo it, we've got to find a way to move forward and change the rules a bit so that we're no longer giving a leg up to women, providing them an advantage in court, leveling the playing field when it comes to separations and divorces and child custody. And we got to maybe change the marriage contract. I'm thinking that we need something akin to a annual renewable life insurance policy, where every year the marriage license or the marriage renews unless one party bugs out. And if one party decides not to renew, then the marriage is annulled or it ends. No lawyers needed, no courts needed. There's a contract that automatically fulfills all of the provisions, and the two people go their own way. Now, there obviously have to be some legal guidance. You couldn't just have a completely blank page kind of contract. It would have to be sort of a boilerplate, and you would have to give up a certain percentage of assets that were at least accumulated during the course of the marriage. but maybe you'll be able to exclude assets that were accumulated prior to the marriage. I think that would be fair. You could have that contract renew for a set period of time, say like for 20 years, and then at the end of that 20 years, if the two people still wanted to continue in the relationship, they could negotiate a new contract, and a new policy would be written, or a new marriage license would be written with new provisions and a new renewability clause. To me, that makes the most sense. What we have right now, where a man gives a commitment that's open-ended for the rest of his life, essentially, and the woman can withdraw intimacy at any time, seems out of balance. It's like, wait a second now, this transaction has nullified itself. Like if I stop paying my mortgage, they come and take my house. If I stop paying for my car, they come and take my car. A woman stops being intimate with her husband and she gets the car and the house. Isn't that the way it works? Anyway, we gotta find a new way to manage this shit, because this ain't gonna work the way we're doing it. You know, what's gonna end up happening? So all the men are gonna go to Thailand and the Philippines and places like that and marry up all the young girls there. And those guys are gonna get pissed. You know, those men there and be like, what are we gonna do? Anyway, I hope you guys.
And just to kind of add on to that, I agree, man. It's like the only power, and this is why I say this, the only power that we really have is to leave. And again, most men, when they get into relationships, it's an emotional thing. You have an emotional tie. And so it's very difficult for you to essentially nuke the whole thing by leaving. But how I think about it is, when a person, the other person in the relationship, decides not to fulfill their duties, or even worse, treat you horribly, then they're nuking it themselves. And you're simply just displaying self-respect at that point. You know, but I highly agree. There has to be some type of method, because the one thing that as men that we did is we focused on protecting others from ourselves. We have a lot of rules and structures that help control the physicalities of men. And what we're realizing, which I think honestly a lot of feminists are going to do, believe it or not, is they're going to create this new system that polices women's strengths, as far as emotions, as far as rumors, as far as things of that nature. Because right now we want to put a box around men and our physicality, which we should. But again, we completely ignored women. And right now what we're doing is we're allowing them to express themselves fully from light to dark, and let them use it for good or for evil without any consequences. So marriage right now, it's just, there's more of an incentive to get married and to leave the marriage for women versus for men. And over time, as long as we have these conversations and we start checking out, that's going to ultimately change. Let me know what you guys think. Put them in the comments. And then with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.